One of my favorite quotes of all time is a Nelson Mandela quote that goes, "As long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality exist in our world, none of us can truly exist." I think this quote is so inspirational, and it starts talking about an issue that simply isn't talked about enough, the issue of poverty. Today, I want to talk through about how we can all be a part of this solution, no matter who you are or where you come from or whatever your financial position is, how we can all come together to solve this issue through knowledge, through something called financial literacy. So let's begin right there. Let's begin with a clear definition of what financial literacy is. I really love the Asian Bank Institute and how they define it, of people's understanding of financial concepts, as well as the skills and abilities to manage their money and make informed financial decisions. See, when you're financially literate, you have the foundation to a relationship with money, and it's a lifelong journey of learning. See, the earlier you start, the better off you are, because education is really the key to success when it comes to managing your money. I like to think about our relationship with our personal finances kind of like running a marathon, and there's a couple components to this marathon. And I like to think of our financial literacy as our running shoes. And so I've never run a marathon and I've never tried this, but if you were to run a marathon without any shoes at all, I imagine you would get pretty hurt in the process, right? Now, the same thing is with money. If you've never had the opportunity to develop a strong relationship in terms of your personal financial literacy, then you could be seriously burned by not understanding how to manage your money. But by setting yourself up with a great start to a lifelong journey with money, you could be setting yourself up for a lot of success. Now, currently, financial literacy is offered in a variety of capacities throughout the world, everything from online courses to different classes taught at universities, but the way that most of us learn and start our relationship with our personal finances comes from our households that we grew up in. Now, some high schools are starting to offer a variety of different requirements and classes, and we'll get into talking about this in a little bit, but a lot of underserved communities still don't have the access to that financial literacy. In today's world, financial products and services have become so popular and so important to our society. Think about how sophisticated our financial behavior has become in just recent generations. A couple generations ago, everything you paid for was in cash. You put all of your money into a bank and you maybe invested in some low-yield bonds for your children or grandchildren, and that was it. In today's world, now we have credit cards and debit cards, house loans, 401ks, car loans, cryptocurrency, Dogecoin. What the heck even is Dogecoin? I still don't know. And the list goes on, and it gets so confusing. Each has its own set of laws and regulations and return rates, and it's almost like playing a game that's set up for you to lose, and it's a lot to keep track of. And so, especially if you've never been exposed to healthy money habits or financial literacy. Unfortunately, for most Americans, it seems that financial illiteracy is very common. According to a report done by FINRA, which is basically all the people that make the rules for all these banks and financial institutions, as of 2021, 66% of Americans are financially illiterate. And in this report and in this study that they did, they found a lot of good research. And so let's dig into some of the statistics that they found. So one concept that a lot of personal financial literacy courses will teach you is that you should spend less than what you make every month. So let's say in a given month that you make $3,000. You would be advised to spend less than that $3,000 and whatever left over to save or invest that. According to the study, 53% of respondents with higher financial literacy did just that, compared to 35% of respondents with lower financial literacy. 53 to 35, that's quite a gap. Another important money management technique is to have an emergency fund. Money set aside to, if something was to ever happen, like an emergency, let's think about like a fire or medical bills or a car crash, have that money, that buffer set aside. This study indicated that 65% of respondents with higher financial literacy did have an emergency fund, compared to 43% of respondents with the lower financial literacy, 65 to 43. Now, this is just two ways and two examples of the way that financial literacy helps individuals to make smarter financial decisions. So we know the importance of financial literacy. It doesn't just provide us with useless knowledge like how to write a check. It actually provides us with the tools and skills to be successful with our money and to be able to do some really cool things, whether that's save for your kids to go to college, be able to retire early, or to be able to give generously to the charities and donations that we care a lot about. We understand its importance, and so now we start to connect to the issue of poverty and start to connect the dots here. So at the beginning of 2020, it was estimated that just over 588 million people in the world were living in extreme poverty. That's approximately 7.7% of the global population that lives below the international poverty line of $1.90 per day. Comparing that to the US and the way that we look at the poverty line, which is your annual income based on the number of people in your household, 37.9 million people were living below the poverty line. That's 11.6% of our US population. Another way to put that is that these people don't have access to basic needs such as food or water, shelter, or clothing. Concern Worldwide, which is Ireland's largest humanitarian and aid agency, they analyze these cycles of poverty and how they kind of translate throughout the world and within our countries. And they came up with 4 pretty neat ways to analyze poverty, 4 cycles of poverty. And so for most people, these cycles of poverty, without any outside intervention, this is a cycle that they've likely inherited from their parents, and they're extremely likely to pass it down to their children. So let's start with the 4 ways that they define these cycles of poverty. The first type is the occasionally poor. This group of people can expect to spend most of their time, long periods of time, living above the poverty line. Now, there might be some unexpected event, some shock that happens to them that might trigger them to go below the poverty line for some time period. But usually this group spends long stretches of time above the poverty line. These are the occasionally poor. Our second group is the cyclical poor. Now, this group of individuals, they spend times going above and below the poverty line. They have those same triggers that the occasionally poor does, but these triggers happen more consistently, but on a less severe basis. This is the situation that a lot of folks who rely on agriculture face on every year. So where they're going above and below the poverty on a yearly or monthly basis. And this might be because some of the hungry seasons that come in between harvests, even without a drought or without flooding. Our third type of poverty, or third cycle of poverty rather, is those that are usually poor. This can be seen as the inverse of the occasionally poor. This group of people can expect to spend long periods of time below the poverty line, but due to some unanticipated help, that might help them go above the poverty line. This might come in the form as some high income labor. And our fourth type of poverty, our fourth poverty cycle is the always poor. Like the usually poor, this group of individuals spend majority of the time below the poverty line, but even with some fluctuations in their income, they tend to spend all of their time below the poverty line. And so we kind of analyzed the 4 different types of poverty that exist throughout the world and within the United States. And then 2020 came. And I don't have to begin to tell you the impact that the pandemic had and how it affected so many individuals, families, communities, and countries throughout the world. But when we talk about the economic impact that these communities that struggled the most throughout the pandemic and are still struggling today, it's those with the highest poverty rates before the pandemic hit. See, we saw this uneven economic recovery in our country, in which these really wealthy communities were able to recover really quickly, whereas these communities with higher poverty rates are still struggling today. That's because when you're living day to day and you lose those financial resources that you count on, there's nothing to fall back onto. There's no buffer, there's no emergency fund, there's no job, and it's really hard to climb back. Additionally, the low financial literacy rates in our communities mean that these cycles of poverty often continue intergenerationally, like we talked about, passing it down to their children. And this is how financial margin is created and how that margin becomes greater. Because when you have something so devastating happen, these communities simply cannot recover. And this next statistic really goes to show the gap in financial literacy and the need that we have throughout our nation. And a study done by Next Gen Personal Finance, throughout the nation in which schools that at least 75% of students were eligible for free or reduced lunch, a common metric that is used to measure low-income communities and schools. And schools where at least 75% of students were eligible for free or reduced lunch. Only 3.9% of students were required to take one semester of personal financial literacy. That's the need. That's the gap. See, we all know the importance of financial literacy. Financial literacy empowers communities. It will lead to stronger food security and a stronger and more educated workforce, which translates to lower crime rates, less stress in our lives, fewer foreclosures in our neighborhoods, and overall, happier people. In financially capable communities, everyone benefits. The problem doesn't lie in what we teach, but it's where we teach it. Financial literacy in underserved communities must be a national priority. Underserved communities have very little to no buffer to be able to absorb economic shock like a pandemic, and will soon become a national crisis, and it already is. Within the United States, there's these cycles of poverty, and there's an unlikely chance that these children in low-income families will ever break this cycle. So it begs the question, what do we do? And I'm not here today to propose anything super out of the ordinary. What I'm here to propose is to start the conversation. Talk to somebody about it. Support an existing initiative or take part in community events, and contribute to organizations that are working to promote financial literacy in underserved communities, like the YMCA or United Way. Every April, so this April here in a week, every April is National Financial Literacy Month. And this is your opportunity to take part in some of the ongoing initiatives there is to promote financial literacy in communities throughout the world. Because as long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality exist in our world, none of us can truly exist. Thank you.